Miss Marple and the Three Murders the Night Before Christmas. Welcome to Cafe Tales. I'm Ailey. Are you counting the days to the winter holidays, New Year, and Christmas? Or do you prefer the easy warmth of summertime? Tell us below, and don't forget to subscribe so our cozy community can keep growing. Now let's begin tonight's mystery. Chapter 1. Arrival at Greystone Manor. The train rattled through the gathering dusk, and Miss Jane Marple pressed her gloved hand gently against the cold window, watching the countryside grow steadily whiter. Snow had begun to fall in earnest now, soft flakes dancing past the glass like scattered confetti at a particularly subdued wedding. She thought of Mrs. Briggs from the village, who always said that snow before Christmas meant secrets would be revealed before the new year. Fanciful, of course, but there was often truth in country sayings. The invitation from Colonel Harcourt had come as something of a surprise. They were not intimate friends, merely acquaintances from a garden fete the previous summer, where Miss Marple had admired the roses at Greystone Manor, and mentioned quite casually that she would be spending Christmas alone this year. The Colonel's wife had insisted, with that particular brand of forceful kindness that allowed no refusal, that Miss Marple must come to them. Just a small gathering, Mrs. Harcourt had written in her flowing script. Nothing elaborate, simply good company and a peaceful Christmas. As the taxi from the station wound its way up the long drive, Miss Marple observed that Greystone Manor was every inch the proper country house. Built of gray stone that seemed to absorb the failing light, it stood 3 stories tall, with ivy climbing its walls in dark tendrils. Lights glowed warmly from the windows, promising comfort within, though Miss Marple noted with interest that one window on the second floor remained quite dark. Someone, it seemed, had not yet arrived. The front door opened before she could knock, and a nervous-looking maid stood framed in the golden light of the hallway. "Miss Marple, ma'am." "I'm Elsie. Do come in from the cold." The girl's hands trembled slightly as she took Miss Marple's coat. She was young, perhaps 20, with pale features and red-rimmed eyes that suggested either a recent cold or recent tears. Miss Marple smiled at her kindly. "Thank you, my dear. What dreadful weather for Christmas Eve." "Yes, ma'am. They say we'll be snowed in by morning." Elsie's voice dropped to a near whisper. "Some folks say that's unlucky. Now, Elsie, don't go filling our guest's head with superstitions." Mrs. Harcourt appeared from a doorway to the right, her silk evening dress rustling as she moved forward with outstretched hands. She was a handsome woman in her late 40s with carefully arranged dark hair and a smile that seemed painted on. "Dear Miss Marple, how delightful that you've arrived safely. The storm is getting quite fierce. So kind of you to have me, Mrs. Harcourt. Nonsense. The Colonel and I are positively thrilled. Now come, everyone is gathering in the drawing room. Elsie, take Miss Marple's case to the rose room." As they walked through the paneled hallway, Miss Marple took note of the house's quiet elegance. Nothing showy, but everything of quality, the sort of home that spoke of old money carefully maintained. Yet there was something in Mrs. Harcourt's manner, a brittleness beneath the polish that reminded Miss Marple of Mrs. Cavendish back home, who had smiled and smiled right up until her husband's business collapsed. The drawing room was magnificent. A fire blazed in the hearth, casting dancing shadows across the Persian carpet. A Christmas tree stood in the corner, dressed with modest ornaments and candles not yet lit. 3 people turned as they entered. Miss Marple. Colonel Harcourt came forward, a tall man with military bearing and iron-gray hair. His handshake was firm, but Miss Marple noticed the faint tremor in his fingers, nerves or perhaps something else. "Delighted you could join us." "May I introduce my brother, Edward?" The second man bore a strong family resemblance, but lacked the Colonel's upright posture. Edward Harcourt was softer around the middle, with tired eyes and a weak chin. He bowed slightly. "Miss Marple, charming to meet you." My brother speaks highly of your roses." "How kind," Miss Marple murmured as she settled into the chair Mrs. Harcourt indicated. "Have you come far, Mr. Harcourt?" A brief glance passed between the brothers before Edward answered. "From London. Rather a last-minute arrangement, actually. Family and all that." The colonel cleared his throat, a shade too loudly, and gestured toward the third figure. "And this is Mrs. Selby, recently returned from abroad." Mrs. Selby was striking rather than beautiful, perhaps 40 years old, dressed in a burgundy gown that suited her dark coloring. She moved with the languid grace of someone accustomed to admiration. But there was a sharpness in her eyes that belied her lazy smile. "Miss Marple, how refreshing to have someone sensible join our little party. I was beginning to fear we'd have nothing but politics and hunting talk all evening." Her voice carried the faintest trace of an accent, though Miss Marple could not quite place it. "I understand you've been traveling, Mrs. Selby." "India, mostly. My late husband had business interests there, but one grows weary of the heat and the dust." England at Christmas seemed suddenly appealing. The door opened, and a stocky gentleman in country tweeds entered, carrying a medical bag. "Ah, Dr. March," the colonel said with evident relief. "Managed to get here before the roads became impossible." "Only just." "The wind is positively savage." Dr. March nodded to Miss Marple with professional courtesy. "You must be our visitor from St. Mary Mead. The colonel mentioned you grow remarkable lupins." "Delphiniums, actually," Miss Marple murmured, though she smiled. It was interesting that the colonel had discussed her at all with the doctor. "You're local, Dr. March? The village?" "Yes, known the family for years. The colonel's father delivered me into the world. In a manner of speaking." Miss Marple noticed Mrs. Harcourt's expression tighten at those words, and Mrs. Selby's fingers drummed once sharply against the arm of her chair. Edward Harcourt stared into the fire, his face unreadable. The conversation turned to safer topics, the weather and the approaching holiday, but Miss Marple kept her knitting needles clicking steadily, and her eyes watchful. The tension in the room was palpable, like the pressure before a thunderstorm. These people smiled and spoke pleasantries, but they watched one another with barely concealed weariness. It reminded her of the Smithson family tea just before the eldest son announced his father's will had been changed. Everyone had been terribly polite then, too. Outside, the snow fell harder. Through the window, Miss Marple could see the white shroud spreading across the lawns and drive. By morning, they would indeed be quite cut off from the world. She wondered, not for the first time, why Colonel Harcourt had really invited her to Greystone Manor for Christmas. Chapter 2. An Unwelcome Guest. Dinner was served at 8 o'clock in the dining room, a formal affair, despite Mrs. Harcourt's assurances of simplicity. The table gleamed with silver and crystal, and Elsie moved nervously between the guests, her hands still prone to that faint trembling Miss Marple had noticed earlier. The soup was excellent, a rich consommé, but the conversation remained strained. Colonel Harcourt spoke too heartily about the pheasant shooting, while his brother Edward barely touched his food. Mrs. Selby contributed witty observations about Delhi society that fell rather flat, and Dr. March maintained the determinedly cheerful manner of a man trying to lift spirits at a sickbed. Miss Marple, eating her soup with small, precise movements, observed them all. "More wine, Miss Marple." The colonel held the decanter poised. "No, thank you, Colonel. I find it makes me quite talkative, and I do prefer to listen." She smiled gently. "One learns so much more that way," Mrs. Harcourt laughed, a brittle sound. "How very wise. I'm sure you've encountered all sorts of interesting characters in your village." "Oh, yes. Human nature is much the same everywhere. I find the same small jealousies, the same little secrets." "Secrets?" Edward Harcourt's fork clattered against his plate. What an odd word to choose for Christmas Eve dinner, is it? Miss Marple's needles had been left upstairs, but her fingers moved in her lap as if knitting nonetheless. I was thinking of Mrs. Bartlett in my village. She kept a secret for 30 years about who had really broken the vicar's window. It weighed on her terribly. When it finally came out, she said it was like putting down a heavy case after a long journey. The silence that followed was profound. Dr. March broke it by requesting the salt. But Miss Marple had seen Mrs. Selby's hand tighten on her wineglass, and the Colonel's face had gone quite pale. They were midway through the fish course when the doorbell rang. The sound seemed to freeze everyone at the table. Elsie, who had been clearing plates, stopped so abruptly that a fork slid to the floor with a clatter. Who on earth could that be? Mrs. Harcourt's voice was sharp. In this weather? The Colonel rose, his napkin falling forgotten to his chair. I'll see to it. But before he could move, the dining room door opened and a man stepped in, shaking snow from his dark overcoat. He was perhaps 50, lean and pale, with the sort of face that suggested he smiled rarely and meant it never. Forgive the intrusion. His voice was smooth, like oil on water. The roads are becoming quite impossible. Your maid was kind enough to admit me, Mr. Avery. The Colonel's tone was flat. All the forced heartiness drained away. This is unexpected, is it? The man's eyebrows rose fractionally. I wrote to inform you I would be calling on Christmas Eve with the papers we discussed. Perhaps the letter went astray in the holiday post? Miss Marple watched Mrs. Harcourt's face. The woman had gone quite white, and her eyes darted to her husband with something very like panic. There must be some mistake, Mrs. Harcourt said quickly. We arranged no such visit. Surely this could wait until after the holiday. Alas, no. Mr. Avery removed his gloves with deliberate care. The matter is rather urgent. Legal documents, you understand. They require the Colonel's signature tonight. Edward Harcourt pushed back from the table. Leonard, the single word carried weight and something else. Recognition, certainly, but also distaste. So they knew each other, Miss Marple thought. How interesting that Edward had not mentioned it. Still lingering in your brother's shadow, I see. Avery's smile was unpleasant. Dr. March, Mrs. Selby, what a cozy gathering this is. Quite the reunion. Mrs. Selby had frozen with a wineglass halfway to her lips. She set it down with exaggerated care. Mr. Avery, I'd not realized you were acquainted with the Colonel. Oh, we're all acquainted in one way or another, aren't we? Old times, old connections. His gaze swept the table and lingered on Miss Marple. And you are, Miss Marple, merely a guest. How fortunate for you. Something in his tone suggested he did not think her fortunate at all. Colonel Harcourt seemed to collect himself. Well, since you're here, we might as well conclude this business. My study, I think, if you'll all excuse us. Actually, Avery said, pulling out the empty chair beside Edward, I haven't dined yet, and I find business settles better on a full stomach. You don't mind, Mrs. Harcourt? What could she say? Miss Marple watched the woman struggle between social obligation and clear desire to refuse. Breeding one as it generally did. Of course not. Elsie, another place setting. The remainder of the meal was agony thinly disguised as civility. Mr. Avery ate with evident enjoyment, making small comments that seemed innocent enough but left awkward silences in their wake. He mentioned Kolkata, and Mrs. Selby nearly choked on her wine. He spoke of a bank in London, and Edward excused himself briefly, returning with a handkerchief pressed to his forehead. Miss Marple noticed everything. She noticed that Dr. March would not meet Avery's eyes. She noticed Mrs. Harcourt's hands shaking as she rang for dessert. She noticed the Colonel's signature tremor had grown more pronounced. Most of all, she noticed that when Avery smiled at his hosts, it was the smile of a man holding all the cards in a very high-stakes game. After dinner, the Colonel and Avery retired to the study. The door closed with a definitive click, and the remaining guests drifted to the drawing room with the relieved air of prisoners granted temporary reprieve. "Dreadful man," Mrs. Selby murmured, arranging herself on the sofa. "Who is he exactly?" "A solicitor," Edward said shortly. "And other things," Dr. March added, his tone carrying a warning. Miss Marple settled into her chair by the fire, her knitting emerging from her bag. "He seems to know you all quite well." "London legal circles are small," Dr. March said too quickly. "One encounters the same people repeatedly." "Of course," Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. "Rather a village, I suppose. Everyone knowing everyone else's business, sometimes knowing things they'd rather forget." Mrs. Selby rose abruptly. "I think I shall retire. The journey has quite exhausted me." She swept from the room, and Miss Marple observed that Edward's gaze followed her, his expression troubled. Through the door of the study came the murmur of voices too low to distinguish words. Then a sudden, sharp sound, like a hand striking wood. The colonel's voice rose briefly before dropping again to an angry whisper. "This is intolerable," Mrs. Harcourt said to no one in particular. She stood by the window, staring out at the snow that now fell in thick curtains. "We're completely cut off. The telephone lines will be down by morning." Miss Marple thought of the fairy tale, the one about being locked in the castle with the wolf already inside. She kept knitting, her fingers steady, her mind working through the threads of connection she could already see forming. Whatever business Mr. Leonard Avery had with Colonel Harcourt, it was business that touched them all, and none of them, she thought, was pleased to see him here. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind howled around the corners of Greystone Manor, and the snow continued to fall. Chapter 3. Secrets by the Firelight. The study door opened at 9, and Colonel Harcourt emerged looking 10 years older than when he had entered. His face was gray, and that tremor in his hands had become pronounced enough that he thrust them into his pockets. Mr. Avery followed, tucking a folded document into his breast pocket with a satisfied air of a cat that has cornered a mouse. All settled. Then, Avery announced to the room at large, "The colonel has been most cooperative." Mrs. Harcourt rose from her chair, her knuckles white where they gripped the armrest. "Surely you'll be leaving now, Mr. Avery, before the roads become completely impossible." "Too late for that, I'm afraid." He moved to the window and drew back the curtain. The world beyond was nothing but swirling white. "I took the liberty of asking your maid to prepare a room. I trust that's not inconvenient." The word hung in the air like a challenge. Everyone knew it was deeply inconvenient. Everyone also knew there was nothing to be done about it. "Of course not," the colonel said heavily. "We could hardly turn you out into a blizzard. Christian charity and all that. How kind." Avery's smile suggested he found the concept of Christian charity amusing. "Then perhaps we might all enjoy a civilized evening together. Some music, perhaps? I see you have a gramophone." Miss Marple had returned to her knitting, but her eyes moved from face to face with the quick, bright attention of a bird watching for crumbs. She had seen this pattern before in the village, the creditor who smiled too much, the blackmailer who spoke of charity. Mr. Avery reminded her forcibly of Mr. Raffles, who had held a farmer's debt over him until the poor man had collapsed in the street. Mrs. Selby had returned to the drawing room, changed into a different gown. Her composure carefully reconstructed, she accepted a glass of sherry from Dr. March without looking at Mr. Avery at all, which was in itself revealing. People only work that hard to ignore someone who mattered very much. "Music would be delightful," Mrs. Selby said. "Something seasonal, perhaps." Edward moved to the gramophone and sorted through the records with fumbling fingers. He selected something, and soon the room filled with the gentle strains of a carol. "God rest ye merry, gentlemen." Rather ironic under the circumstances, They arranged themselves around the fire with studied casualness, each finding a position that allowed them to avoid sitting too close to Mr. Avery. He seemed to find this amusing and settled himself in the best chair with his sherry, the picture of a man entirely at ease. "This reminds me of Christmas in '98, he said pleasantly. "Do you remember, Edward? That house party at Lord Wickham's estate." Edward's hand jerked, spilling a few drops of sherry on his trousers. "I don't recall, really. I remember it vividly. You and the Colonel both attended. And Dr. March, if memory serves. Quite the merry gathering, until that unfortunate business with the cards." Dr. March set down his glass with a sharp click. "Ancient history, Avery, is it? I find the past has a way of remaining rather present, particularly when certain details were never fully resolved." Miss Marple's needles continued their steady rhythm. She appeared absorbed in her work, but she had caught the quick glance between the Colonel and his brother, and the way Mrs. Harcourt had gone very still. "You must have a remarkable memory, Mr. Avery," Miss Marple observed mildly, "to recall a house party from so long ago." "I make it my business to remember important things, Miss Marple. Details that others might prefer forgotten. How exhausting that must be. I find it difficult enough remembering where I've put my spectacles. The past is such a burden if one carries too much of it." Something flickered in Avery's expression, but he merely raised his glass in a small salute. The gramophone record ended, and in the silence that followed, Mrs. Selby rose and moved to the Christmas tree. "We should light the candles. It seems a shame to have such a lovely tree and leave it dark." "Tomorrow," Mrs. Harcourt said quickly. "Christmas Day would be more appropriate." "Why wait?" Mrs. Selby's voice was light, but there was an edge to it. She produced matches from her box on the mantel and began lighting the small candles nestled among the branches. The flames caught and held, casting dancing shadows across the room. It was then that Miss Marple noticed Mrs. Selby slip something small and white from her sleeve, a note, folded small. As she moved around the tree, she brushed past Edward, and the paper disappeared into his hand with a practiced ease that spoke of prior arrangement. Edward's face remained impassive, but his fingers closed tightly around the note. A moment later, he excused himself with a mumble about needing air and left the room. "Careful with those candles, Mrs. Selby," Dr. March said. "Fire is a dangerous thing in an old house." "Everything is dangerous if one thinks about it too much," Mrs. Selby replied. "Life itself is rather risky, wouldn't you say?" The conversation meandered on, touching on safe topics like the weather in London, theater, and the prospects for next year's roses. But beneath the words, Miss Marple sensed currents of fear and anger, and something else. Desperation, perhaps. It was nearly 11 when Elsie appeared with a tray of tea things. Her eyes were red-rimmed again, and her hands shook so badly that the cups rattled in their saucers. "Steady on, girl," the Colonel said, not unkindly. Elsie set the tray down and turned to leave. But as she did, Mr. Avery spoke. "Tell me, Elsie, have you been in service here long?" The girl froze. 2 years, sir, and before that, I was with Mrs. Selby, sir, in India." Miss Marple saw Mrs. Selby's expression harden just for an instant before smoothing back into careful neutrality. "How interesting," Avery continued. "You must have seen quite a lot in India. I understand it was a very eventful time for Mrs. Selby's household." "That's quite enough." Mrs. Selby's voice was sharp as broken glass. "Leave the girl alone." Elsie fled, and the tray she'd been holding clattered to the floor in the hallway. The sound of her running footsteps echoed through the house. "Really, Avery?" Dr. March said heavily. "Must you terrorize the servants?" "I merely asked a question. If the girl is frightened, perhaps she has reason to be." Mrs. Harcourt stood abruptly. "I think we should all retire. It's been a long and trying day." There were murmurs of agreement. though Miss Marple noted that no one seemed eager to leave the safety of the lighted room. Eventually, however, the gathering broke up, and the guests made their way toward the stairs. Miss Marple lingered, ostensibly to collect her knitting bag. In truth, she wanted a moment to observe the room now that it was empty. The fire had burned low, casting the corners into shadow. The Christmas tree candles had been snuffed, leaving the faint scent of wax in the air. Something white caught her eye, there beneath the rug near where Edward had been standing. Miss Marple bent and retrieved it with her knitting needle. It was the note Mrs. Selby had passed to Edward. He must have dropped it in his haste to leave. The paper was fine quality, and the handwriting was an elegant slant. He knows. Destroy it before morning. Miss Marple read the words twice, then carefully folded the note and placed it in her knitting bag. She had no intention of destroying anything. In her experience, it was always better to know what people were desperate to hide. As she made her way upstairs, she heard voices from the Colonel's study, low, urgent, angry, and then a laugh from Mr. Avery, cold and triumphant. Miss Marple went to her room and locked the door. Outside, the snow continued to fall, sealing them all inside Greystone Manor with their secrets, and their fears, and with whatever terrible thing would happen before morning. Chapter 4. The First. Death. Miss Marple had just turned down the coverlet on her bed when the scream tore through the house. It was a woman's scream, high and sharp, cutting through the quiet like a knife through silk. Miss Marple moved with surprising speed for a woman of her years, snatching up her shawl and hurrying to the door. The hallway was already filling with people. Mrs. Harcourt emerged from her room in a dressing gown, her face pale without its careful powder. Dr. March appeared at the top of the stairs, still fully dressed. Edward came from the opposite end of the corridor, and Mrs. Selby stood in her doorway, one hand pressed to her throat. "What on earth?" Colonel Harcourt's voice boomed from below. Who screamed? "It was Elsie, sir?" The maid stood at the foot of the stairs, trembling violently. "In the study, sir. Mr. Avery, he's— Oh, sir, I think he's dead." They descended in a confused rush, propriety forgotten. The study door stood open, lamplight spilling into the dark hallway. Miss Marple followed at a more measured pace, her sharp eyes taking in details. The corridor was cold. Someone had left a window open somewhere. Mr. Leonard Avery sat in the Colonel's leather chair behind the desk, slumped forward with his head resting on his arms. For a moment he might have been sleeping, except that sleeping men do not have that peculiar stillness, that absolute absence of breath. Dr. March pushed through to the desk and checked for a pulse at Avery's neck. His face was grim as he straightened. Dead. Has been for perhaps 20 minutes, I should think. But how? Mrs. Harcourt's voice was faint. What happened to him? Heart failure, most likely. Dr. March loosened Avery's collar and examined him with professional efficiency. He's still warm. The body hasn't begun to stiffen. The door was locked, Elsie whispered. From the inside, sir. I heard a sound like something falling and I knocked, but there was no answer, so I fetched the Colonel and he had to use his key. Miss Marple moved closer, though she took care not to disturb anything. The room smelled of cigars and brandy, and something else, something faintly bitter that reminded her of the almonds Mrs. Krause used in her Christmas cake. Locked from the inside, you say? Miss Marple's voice was gentle. Yes, ma'am. The Colonel held up a key. My study has only 2 keys. I carry one and the other hangs in the kitchen. Both were accounted for. The key was in the lock on the inside when I opened the door. How very curious. Miss Marple observed the desk with interest. A glass of brandy stood near Avery's right hand, still half full. Papers were scattered across the blotter, and she recognized the document that Avery had made the Colonel sign earlier. The wax seal had been broken, and the papers lay open. Dr. March was examining Avery's face more closely now, using his pocket torch. Curious? The color of his lips is somewhat unusual, and there's a faint discoloration around the mouth. What does that mean? Edward's voice was hoarse. I'm not certain yet. Dr. March straightened, his expression troubled. Colonel, I think we should send for the police. In this weather? Impossible. The roads won't be passable until the storm breaks. Nevertheless, I must be frank with you all. Dr. March looked around at the assembled faces. I suspect Mr. Avery did not die of natural causes. The symptoms suggest poison. The word fell into the silence like a stone into still water. Mrs. Selby swayed slightly, and Edward moved to steady her. Mrs. Harcourt made a small, choked sound. Poison? The colonel's face had gone the color of old parchment. That's impossible. How could the brandy? Miss Marple spoke quietly, but everyone turned to look at her. I wonder if anyone saw him pour it. I did, ma'am. Elsie's voice was barely audible. He came in here after everyone went upstairs. I was in the hall tidying, and I saw him through the door before he closed it. He poured himself a drink from the decanter there on the sideboard. And you saw no one else enter? No, ma'am. The door closed and I heard the key turn. I went about my duties in the other rooms. Then, perhaps 15 minutes later, I heard that sound like a book falling and I came to check. Miss Marple moved to the sideboard. The crystal decanter stood there, still stoppered, the brandy within glowing amber in the lamplight. 3 glasses sat beside it, all clean. May I? She looked at Dr. March, who nodded carefully. Using her handkerchief, Miss Marple lifted the glass from the desk and brought it to her nose. She did not drink, merely inhaled gently. Yes, there it was, that bitter almond scent, faint but unmistakable beneath the brandy. Cyanide, I should think, she said calmly. Rather a classic choice. Bitter almonds are quite distinctive once one knows what to look for. Dr. March took the glass from her and sniffed it himself. His face grew even more grave. You're quite right, Miss Marple. I should have recognized it immediately. The discoloration, the rapidity of death, all consistent with cyanide poisoning. But the door was locked. Mrs. Harcourt seemed unable to move past this point. From the inside, how could anyone have poisoned him? The brandy was already poisoned, Edward said slowly, before he poured it. It must have been. Dr. March unstoppered the decanter and smelled it carefully. No, the brandy itself is untainted. Only the glass held poison. Then someone entered after he poured his drink and before the door was locked, Miss Marple suggested. Or the poison was introduced in some other fashion. But Elsie saw him lock the door himself. Colonel Harcourt ran a hand through his hair, disheveling it. The windows are all secured from the inside. I checked them myself this evening after Avery arrived. I always check the study windows before retiring. Miss Marple moved to examine the windows. Heavy curtains covered them, and when she drew one back, she found the sash window firmly latched. Snow had drifted against the outside of the glass, undisturbed. No one had opened this window from outside. Perhaps, she said thoughtfully, the poison was in the glass before he poured the brandy. Someone might have prepared it earlier, but who? Mrs. Selby's voice was thin. And why? Miss Marple turned to look at the assembled company. 5 people, not counting herself and the unfortunate maid. 5 people who had all shown discomfort at Avery's presence. 5 people who might have had reason to want him dead. That, she said gently, is what we must discover. Dr. March, I think you're quite right that the police should be informed as soon as possible, but until the road's clear, we are rather on our own. This is preposterous, the colonel's voice shook. A man dead in my study on Christmas Eve. We must maintain some sense of order. No one is to touch anything in this room. We'll lock it again and wait for the authorities. A wise precaution, Miss Marple agreed. Though I wonder if we might examine the document Mr. Avery had with him. It may be relevant. The colonel hesitated, then nodded. Miss Marple bent over the papers, reading quickly. It was a legal document, dense with language, but the essence was clear enough. A confession of embezzlement signed by Colonel Harcourt. Dated that very evening. She said nothing, merely straightened and stepped back. Chapter 5. The Second Knock. Miss Marple did not attempt to sleep. She sat in the chair by her window, her knitting in her lap, watching the snow fall in the darkness. The house had settled into an uneasy quiet after the horror in the study, but she knew that behind closed doors no one was resting peacefully. The clock in the hall struck 11, then past. Miss Marple's fingers moved steadily, creating pattern from chaos, order from disorder. It was what she did best. She was thinking about the locked room. In her experience, locked rooms were rarely as mysterious as they first appeared. Either the lock was picked, or the room was locked after the murder, or the murderer had never left at all. But the study had been thoroughly examined. No one had been hiding there, which left the question of the poisoned glass. Someone had introduced cyanide into that brandy after Avery poured it, or the glass itself had been prepared beforehand. But who had access to the study? And who possessed cyanide? The answer to the second question was troublingly simple. Dr. March would certainly have access to poisons through his medical practice. But could the doctor have prepared the glass before Avery entered? And how would he know which glass Avery would choose? Miss Marple's needles paused. Unless the glasses themselves were irrelevant, unless the poison had been administered in some other way entirely. She was still pondering this when she heard it. A cry from somewhere below, sharp and sudden, followed by a heavy thud. Miss Marple set aside her knitting and opened her door. The hallway was dark, but she could see light spilling from the servants' staircase at the far end. She moved toward it quickly, her soft slippers making no sound on the carpet. Dr. March reached the staircase first, still dressed, a lamp in his hand. The colonel appeared behind him, hastily belting his dressing gown. By the time Miss Marple arrived, Mrs. Harcourt and Edward were also descending from their rooms. At the foot of the servants' stairs lay Elsie. The maid was crumpled at an unnatural angle, her neck bent, one arm flung out as if reaching for something that wasn't there. Her eyes stared at nothing, and a small trickle of blood ran from the corner of her mouth. Dear God, the colonel's voice was hollow. Not another. Dr. March knelt beside the body, but Miss Marple could see from his expression that there was no hope. He confirmed it a moment later, looking up with a grim face. Her neck is broken. She must have fallen from the top of the stairs. Mrs. Harcourt pressed a hand to her mouth. The poor child. She was so frightened tonight, so nervous. She must have tripped in the dark. Perhaps. Dr. March's tone suggested doubt. Miss Marple looked up the narrow staircase. It was steep, certainly the kind of stairs that servants had climbed for generations in houses like this. At the top, a small landing gave access to the servants' quarters. May I? She looked at the colonel, who nodded wearily. Miss Marple climbed the stairs carefully, holding the banister. The wood was smooth and well maintained. At the top, she examined the landing. It was perhaps 4 feet square, with doors leading off to the maids' rooms and the back stairs that descended to the kitchen. She looked for a candle, a lamp, anything that might have been knocked over in a fall. There was nothing. The landing was bare except for a small table against the wall, and on it sat an unlit oil lamp. Untouched, Miss Marple descended slowly, her mind working. Dr. March, she said quietly, might I trouble you to examine the body more carefully? He looked at her sharply, then bent again to his task. His hands moved over Elsie's arms and shoulders, then paused. There are bruises here, on her upper arms. Recent bruises made within the last hour. The kind one might get from being grasped forcefully. Yes, his voice was heavy. Exactly that kind. The implications settled over them like the falling snow. Elsie had not fallen. She had been pushed, but why? Edward's face was ashen. Why would anyone harm the girl? Miss Marple thought of the note she'd found, the one Mrs. Selby had passed to Edward. He knows. Destroy it before morning. And she thought of Elsie's reaction at dinner when Mr. Avery had questioned her about her time in India with Mrs. Selby. I rather think, Miss Marple said gently, that Elsie knew something someone did not want revealed. Mrs. Selby had been standing in the shadows, but now she stepped forward into the lamplight. Her face was carefully composed, but Miss Marple noticed her hands were clenched at her sides. What could a maid possibly know that would matter? A great many things, Mrs. Selby. Servants see everything. They're rather like furniture in that respect. People forget they're there and speak freely. Elsie served in your household in India. She would have known your affairs quite intimately. That's absurd. But Mrs. Selby's voice lacked conviction. Where was everyone when Elsie fell? Dr. March looked around at the assembled group. In my room, the colonel said. Reading. I was in bed, Mrs. Harcourt added quickly. Edward rubbed his face. I was at my window watching the snow? And you, Mrs. Selby? Miss Marple's voice was mild. In my room, alone, as we all were? Presumably. Miss Marple looked at Dr. March. You were dressed, Doctor. Had you not yet retired? I was reading in the library medical journals. I find they help me settle after unpleasant events. The library is on this floor. Miss Marple glanced around. You would have been close to the servants' staircase. Are you suggesting I push that girl to her death? Dr. March's voice was controlled but angry. I'm a physician. I save lives. I suggest nothing, Doctor. I merely observe. Miss Marple moved closer to where Elsie lay. May I examine her hands? Dr. March stepped back, and Miss Marple knelt with some difficulty beside the body. Elsie's right hand was clenched, and when Miss Marple gently opened the fingers, something small and white fell out, a scrap of paper torn raggedly, with 3 words visible in an elegant slant. Before morning, destroy. It was a piece of the note Miss Marple had found earlier, which meant Elsie must have retrieved it or found it somehow. What is that? The colonel bent to look. A fragment of a note, Miss Marple said. I believe Elsie found it and confronted someone about its contents. That person could not afford to let her speak. But we don't even know what the note said. Edward's voice was too loud. Miss Marple looked at him steadily. Don't we, Mr. Harcourt? He paled but said nothing. This is intolerable. The colonel's voice shook. 2 deaths in one night? We must lock ourselves in our rooms. No one is to leave until morning. No one is to be alone with anyone else. A sensible precaution, Miss Marple agreed, though I fear the damage has already been done. Dr. March, what should be done with poor Elsie? She should be moved somewhere cool. The study is locked, but perhaps the morning room. We cannot leave her here. The colonel and Dr. March carried the body between them, and Mrs. Harcourt fetched a sheet to cover it. The small procession was grim and silent. When Elsie was laid out in the morning room and the door closed, they stood in the hallway, looking at one another with new suspicion. Someone among them was a killer, someone who had poisoned Mr. Avery and murdered poor Elsie to keep her silent. To your rooms, the colonel said. Lock your doors. Stay there until daylight. They dispersed slowly, each watching the others. Miss Marple climbed the stairs last, pausing to look back at the now empty hallway. 2 dead in one night, and she suspected with a cold certainty that the killer was not yet finished. The note had said, before morning, Chapter 6. The locked room at midnight. Miss Marple sat in the darkness of her room, her hands still at last, her mind racing. The house had fallen into a silence that felt less like peace, and more like the held breath before a scream. She thought about patterns. In St. Mary Mead, she had learned that human nature repeated itself endlessly. The same jealousies, the same fears, the same desperate acts born of cornered panic. Mr. Avery had been a blackmailer. She was certain of it now, the way he had smiled, the way he had spoken of the past, the document he had forced the colonel to sign. All the hallmarks of a man who traded in secrets, and Elsie, poor, frightened Elsie, who had served Mrs. Selby in India and recognized Mr. Avery, who had clutched that scrap of paper in her dying hand. What had she known? What had she threatened to reveal? The clock struck midnight, 3 soft chimes that seemed to echo through the house like a warning. Miss Marple rose and moved to her window. The snow had lessened, falling now in soft, lazy flakes rather than the earlier blizzard. The grounds of Greystone Manor lay white and pristine under the faint light of a cloud-shrouded moon. And then she saw it. A light moving. It was faint, barely more than a glimmer, passing from left to right across her field of vision. Miss Marple pressed closer to the cold glass. The light was coming from the ground floor, she thought, moving from the direction of the study toward the drawing room. Someone was awake. Someone was moving through the house. Miss Marple did not hesitate. She wrapped her shawl around her shoulders, picked up the small oil lamp from her bedside table, and quietly unlocked her door. The hallway was dark and cold. She could hear faint snoring from one of the rooms, the colonel most likely, but otherwise silence. She moved carefully toward the stairs, her lamp held low, one hand trailing along the wall for balance. The stairs creaked softly under her weight, but she descended slowly, pausing on each step to listen. At the bottom, she could see a faint glow coming from beneath the drawing-room door. Miss Marple approached cautiously. The door was slightly ajar, and through the gap she could see the flicker of candlelight. She heard a soft sound, like drawers being opened and closed, papers being shuffled. She pushed the door open. Mrs. Selby stood by the writing desk, a candle in one hand, rifling through the contents of a drawer with the other. She froze when she saw Miss Marple, her face pale in the wavering light. "Miss Marple, you startled me, forgive me. I saw a light and thought perhaps someone was unwell." Miss Marple entered the room, her eyes taking in every detail. "You could not sleep either." "No." Mrs. Selby closed the drawer slowly. "The events of the evening have been rather disturbing." "Indeed. What are you looking for?" The direct question hung in the air. Mrs. Selby's jaw tightened. "Nothing. I merely thought I had left my handkerchief here earlier." "In the writing desk?" Miss Marple's tone was mild. "How curious. I'm not accustomed to being questioned like a criminal, Miss Marple." "Of course not. Though I confess I'm rather curious about several things. The note you passed to Edward at the Christmas tree, for instance, and what else he might have known about your time in India." Mrs. Selby's hand trembled, and hot wax dripped onto the carpet. "I don't know what you mean." "I think you do. Mr. Avery was blackmailing you, wasn't he? And the colonel as well. Something that happened long ago, something you all wish to keep buried." For a long moment, Mrs. Selby said nothing. Then her shoulders sagged slightly. "You're very perceptive for a village spinster. Village life teaches one a great deal about human nature." Mrs. Selby moved to the sofa and sat, setting the candle on the side table. In the soft light, she looked older, the careful polish worn away by exhaustion and fear. "Yes, Avery was blackmailing me. He had been for years. That's why I returned to England. I could no longer afford to pay him." "And what was he blackmailing you about?" "My husband's death in India." Mrs. Selby's voice was flat. It was ruled an accident, a fall from a balcony during a party. But Avery knew the truth. He knew I had pushed him. Miss Marple sat down across from her. Why? Because he was a brute who beat me and threatened to cut me off without a penny if I left him. Because I was young and foolish and desperate. Because I wanted to be free. She looked at Miss Marple with haunted eyes. Does that shock you? Very little shocks me anymore, Mrs. Selby. But I confess I'm puzzled. If you killed your husband and Avery knew it, why did you kill Avery now? Surely that would only increase suspicion. I didn't kill him. The words came out fierce and desperate. I swear to you, Miss Marple, I wanted him dead. God help me, I wished him dead 1,000 times, but I didn't poison him. Then who did? I don't know. Mrs. Selby twisted her hands in her lap. But I think it had more to do with the Colonel than with me. That document Avery made him sign, I saw it in the study. A confession of embezzlement. You were in the study after Mr. Avery died. Mrs. Selby hesitated, then nodded. Yes, after everyone went upstairs. I needed to see that document. I needed to know if it mentioned me. And the door was locked. I have a key. I took it from the kitchen earlier this evening. I knew Avery would have the document and I needed to see it. Miss Marple leaned forward. Tell me exactly what you saw. Avery was already dead, slumped at the desk. I nearly screamed, but I stopped myself. The document was there, open. I read it quickly. It was only about the Colonel, nothing about me. I relocked the door and returned the key to the kitchen. Then I heard Elsie scream, and everyone came running. So you were the first to discover the body? Yes, but I didn't kill him, Miss Marple. I swear it, Miss Marple studied her carefully. The woman was terrified, but seemed to be telling the truth, or at least a version of it. And what were you looking for just now in the writing desk? The note, the one I gave Edward. He told me he had lost it, and I was frantic. If anyone found it, if they understood what it meant, she trailed off. It's too late for that, I'm afraid. Elsie found it. That's what she was holding when she died. Mrs. Selby went very pale. Then she knew. She knew about India, about my husband. She was going to tell. Did you push her down the stairs? No. The word came out as a sob. I wanted to. I thought about it, but I couldn't. I'm not a murderer, Miss Marple. Not really. What happened in India was madness, desperation. I couldn't do it again. Miss Marple rose and walked to the window. She drew back the curtain and looked out at the snow-covered grounds. The window was slightly ajar, just an inch, and cold air seeped through the gap. Fresh snow had blown onto the sill, creating a small drift, and there beside the snow lay a single glove, a man's glove made of fine leather. Miss Marple picked it up carefully. Mrs. Selby, was this window open when you entered the room? I don't know. I didn't notice. Miss Marple examined the glove. It was damp with melted snow on one side, dry on the other. Recently dropped then, within the last few minutes. Someone else had been here. Someone who had perhaps stood outside the window listening. Someone who had dropped a glove in their haste to leave. Mrs. Selby, Miss Marple said quietly, I think you should return to your room now, and I think you should lock your door very securely. Why? What does it mean? It means, Miss Marple said, that someone is still moving through this house. Someone who wants very much to ensure certain secrets remain buried. Mrs. Selby fled, her candle flickering wildly. Miss Marple remained at the window, holding the glove, staring out at the snow. 3 deaths the outline had promised. 2 were already dead. Before morning, there would be 1 more. Chapter 7. Snow on the Window Ledge. Miss Marple did not return to her room. Instead, she settled into the chair by the drawing-room fire, which still held a few glowing embers, and waited for morning. The glove lay in her lap, and she studied it carefully in the lamplight. It was expensive, well made, the kind a gentleman would wear, and it bore the faint scent of cigars. The Colonel smoked cigars, so had Mr. Avery, but Dr. March and Edward did not. As far as she had observed, she thought about the window, open just that crucial inch, about the snow on the sill, about someone standing outside in the bitter cold, listening to her conversation with Mrs. Selby, listening to a confession of murder in India. The sky began to lighten, that peculiar gray-blue of winter dawn. The storm had passed entirely now, leaving the world crystalline and silent under its blanket of white. Miss Marple heard movement upstairs, footsteps crossing a floor, water running. The house was waking to Christmas morning, though there would be no joy in this dawn. She rose and moved quietly to the hallway. Dr. March was descending the stairs, already dressed, his medical bag in hand. He stopped when he saw her. "Miss Marple, have you been up all night?" "I find sleep rather elusive after such events, Doctor." "I trust you rested." "Not well." He looked haggard, older than he had the previous day. "I thought I should check on Mr. Avery and the girl, to ensure nothing has been disturbed." "Very professional of you. I wonder, Doctor, are these your gloves?" She held out the leather glove. Dr. March looked at it, then at his own hands, which were bare. "No, mine are upstairs." "Why do you ask?" "I found this by the drawing-room window. Someone dropped it there during the night. The Colonel, perhaps? Or Edward?" "Perhaps." Miss Marple tucked the glove into her shawl pocket. "Tell me, Doctor, how long have you known the Harcourt family?" "All my life. I grew up in the village. The old Colonel, the current Colonel's father, was a patient of my father's practice. I inherited many of the family connections." "Then you would know about any difficulties the family might have faced? Financial troubles, for instance?" Dr. March's expression grew guarded. "I am not at liberty to discuss my patient's private affairs." "Not even when those affairs might involve embezzlement and blackmail?" He was silent for a long moment, then he sighed heavily. "You're very astute, Miss Marple." "Yes, I knew about the Colonel's difficulties. He came to me in confidence some years ago, distraught. He had made poor investments and borrowed against them. When the investments failed, he took money from the regimental funds to cover his debts, intending to replace it before anyone noticed. But someone did. Avery noticed. Avery always noticed such things. He was the sort of man who collected secrets like other men collect stamps, and he's been blackmailing the Colonel ever since. Yes, it's nearly bankrupted the family. Mrs. Harcourt knows nothing of it. The Colonel has been selling off property, letting staff go, anything to meet Avery's demands." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "That explains the document. Avery wanted a written confession, something to hold over the Colonel more completely." A final turn of the screw. Dr. March's voice was bitter. "Avery was an evil man, Miss Marple. I won't pretend to mourn him. Did you kill him?" The question was asked gently, but it hung in the air like the sword of Damocles. Dr. March met her eyes steadily. "No, though I confess I thought about it many times. But I'm a physician. I've spent my life preserving life, not taking it. Cyanide would have been readily available to you." "Yes. I keep a small supply for medicinal purposes, properly secured. But I assure you, Miss Marple, my supply is intact." "You may check if you wish." Before Miss Marple could respond, a cry echoed through the house. Not a scream this time, but a shout of alarm. The Colonel's voice calling for help? They hurried toward the sound. Dr. March took the stairs 2 at a time. Miss Marple followed as quickly as she could, her heart pounding. The Colonel stood in the doorway of Edward's room, his face ashen. "He won't wake." "Edward won't wake." Dr. March pushed past him into the room. Edward lay in his bed, the covers pulled up to his chin, his face peaceful, too peaceful. The unnatural stillness of death. Dear God. Dr. March bent over him, checking for breath, for pulse. His hands moved quickly, professionally, but Miss Marple could see the answer in his face before he spoke. He's dead. Has been for several hours, I should think. Mrs. Harcourt appeared in the doorway, clutching her dressing gown closed. No, not Edward, too. This can't be happening. The colonel moved to his brother's bedside, his hand trembling as he reached out to touch Edward's face. But how? What killed him? Dr. March was examining Edward's hands, his face. There's soot on his fingers and the smell. He moved to the fireplace, which had burned down to cold ashes. The gas fire, it's been left on. Miss Marple joined him at the fireplace. It was a modern installation, a gas fire set into the old hearth. The tap was turned to the on position, though no flame burned. Carbon monoxide, Dr. March said quietly. The fire went out, but the gas kept flowing. In a closed room with the windows shut tight against the cold. He didn't finish the sentence, and then Mrs. Harcourt's voice was desperate, grasping for any explanation that wasn't murder. But Miss Marple was looking at the grate, at the fragments of paper among the ashes. She knelt with some difficulty and used the poker to stir them gently. The corner of a document, partially burned with a wax seal still visible. I think not, she said quietly. Edward was burning something. The document Mr. Avery brought, perhaps, or a copy of it. Why would he do that? The colonel's voice was hollow. Miss Marple rose, brushing ash from her fingers. To protect you, Colonel. I suspect Edward discovered the truth about the blackmail and decided to destroy the evidence. But he didn't realize the danger of the gas fire. Or perhaps, she paused, examining the room more carefully. The windows were firmly latched. The door had been closed, but there, on the bedside table, lay a glass of water with a faint sediment at the bottom. Dr. March, what do you make of this? He examined the glass, sniffed it carefully. A sleeping draught, quite a strong one. Edward took sleeping draughts? Miss Marple asked. Not that I prescribed. Dr. March's face was grim. But they're not difficult to obtain. Miss Marple looked around the room, piecing together the sequence. Edward burning the document to protect his brother. Perhaps someone had given him the sleeping draught earlier, knowing he would retire to his room, knowing the gas fire was unreliable, prone to going out, knowing that in a closed room, the results would be fatal. This was not an accident, she said firmly. Edward was murdered, just as surely as Mr. Avery and poor Elsie. Chapter 4. 8. The Third Candle. They gathered in the drawing room as Christmas. Morning light filtered through the windows, pale and cold. No one had appetite for breakfast, though Mrs. Harcourt had instructed the cook to prepare it. The three bodies lay in separate rooms, doors locked, awaiting the arrival of the police whenever the roads became passable. Miss Marple sat in her customary chair, her knitting bag beside her, though her hands remained still. She was watching, always watching. The colonel paced by the window, his movements jerky and agitated. Mrs. Harcourt perched on the edge of the sofa, twisting a handkerchief between her fingers. Dr. March stood by the fireplace, and Mrs. Selby occupied the chair farthest from everyone else. The telephone lines are still down, the colonel announced, returning from yet another attempt to reach the authorities. And the road remains impossible. We're trapped here with a murderer. Perhaps we should search for the poison, Mrs. Harcourt suggested, her voice thin. Surely whoever killed Mr. Avery must have it hidden somewhere. I've already checked my medical supplies, Dr. March said. My cyanide is accounted for, properly locked away. Then where did it come from? The colonel's voice rose. Someone in this house poisoned that man. Miss Marple cleared her throat gently. If I might make a suggestion, Colonel, I believe it would be instructive to examine the study once more. In daylight, we may notice things we missed last night. What good would that do? Mrs. Selby's voice was sharp with strain. Indulge me, my dear. I find that small details often reveal the largest truths. The colonel retrieved his key, and they made their way to the study. The room looked different in daylight, less sinister, though the presence of death still hung heavy in the air. The colonel had arranged for Avery's body to be moved to the cellar, where the cold would preserve it, so the desk stood empty. Now, Miss Marple moved directly to the desk, her eyes scanning its surface with methodical precision. The brandy glass had been taken away, but the decanter remained. The papers were still scattered across the blotter. "Tell me," she said, "who lit the lamps in here last night when Mr. Avery entered?" "Elsie would have," Mrs. Harcourt replied. "She always prepared the rooms in the evening." "And the candles on the desk?" Miss Marple pointed to the candelabra that stood at the corner of the desk. 3 candles in silver holders, elegant and matching. "Elsie as well, I should think." The colonel frowned. "Why does it matter?" Miss Marple examined the candles closely. 2 were of equal height, burned down perhaps an inch from their original length, but the 3rd candle was noticeably shorter, burned down nearly 3 inches. "How curious," she murmured. "These candles were all new yesterday, were they not?" "Fresh candles for Christmas Eve." "I believe so. Yet this one has burned much longer than the others." Miss Marple bent closer, examining the base of the shorter candle. "And look here. Wax has dripped in 3 distinct spots on the desk. Once here, where the candelabra stands. Once here, several inches to the left. And once here, near the center of the desk." Dr. March moved closer to see. The candelabra was moved, precisely. Someone moved it, then returned it. "But why?" Miss Marple straightened, her eyes bright with understanding. "Unless they needed the light to see something they were doing after Mr. Avery was already dead." "Mrs. Selby," the colonel said suddenly, "you admitted you entered the study last night. You read the document." Mrs. Selby's face flushed. "Yes, but Avery was already dead. I didn't move any candles. The lamp was sufficient. Perhaps you're telling the truth." Miss Marple moved to examine the papers on the desk. "But someone else came after you. Someone who needed to examine these papers more carefully. Someone who perhaps altered them." She picked up the document that Avery had forced the colonel to sign. The wax seal was broken, the pages exposed. She read through it carefully, her lips pursed. "Colonel, you said this was a confession of embezzlement." "Yes, Avery dictated it and I signed it. My shame. My ruin, all written down in legal language." "And yet," Miss Marple said slowly, "this document is not quite what you described." "Oh, it begins as a confession, certainly. But the final page, the one with your signature, makes reference to a witness, someone who knew of your crime and helped conceal it." The colonel went pale. "What? That wasn't in the original." Avery never mentioned a witness, because someone added it later, after Avery was dead. Someone returned to this study, broke the seal, and inserted an additional page. They used the candle to melt fresh wax and reseal the document, making it appear untouched. "But why?" Mrs. Harcourt's voice was barely a whisper. "To implicate someone else, to shift suspicion." Miss Marple looked at each of them in turn. "The person who altered this document is the person who killed Mr. Avery. They wanted insurance, you see. If they were suspected, they could produce this document showing that someone else had motive to silence Avery." Dr. March frowned. "Who does it name as the witness?" Miss Marple read the relevant passage. It states that Dr. James March, physician of this parish, was aware of the embezzlement and advised the colonel on how to conceal it from the military authorities. Dr. March's face went white, then red with fury. "That's a damned lie. I knew nothing of it until years later, and I certainly never advised concealment." "I believe you, doctor, but someone wanted it to appear otherwise." Miss Marple set down the document. Someone who was clever enough to create false evidence, who had access to legal papers and wax seals, who could write in a hand similar to Mr. Avery's. Edward, the colonel breathed. Edward was a clerk in a solicitor's office before he came to live with me. He would have known how to draft such documents. Your brother had the skill, certainly. But did he have the motive? Miss Marple's tone was gentle but firm. Edward tried to burn this document to protect you. He died in the attempt. Why would he first alter it to implicate Dr. March? Then who? Mrs. Harcourt looked around wildly. Who could have done this? Miss Marple returned to the candelabra, examining the wax drippings once more. She touched one of them lightly with her finger, feeling its texture. This wax is slightly different from the candles, a different composition, perhaps a different maker. It was brought here specifically to reseal the envelope. She looked up, her expression grave. Someone came prepared to alter this document. Someone who knew exactly what they would find and what they needed to do. She moved to the window and examined the sill once more, as she had the previous night. The snow had melted somewhat in the daylight, but traces remained, and there, in the wood of the sill, were faint scratches, as if something had scraped against it. Someone opened this window last night, after the murder, after the room was locked. They came from outside, through the window, altered the document, and left again. Impossible, the colonel protested. The window was latched from the inside. I checked it myself. Perhaps, Miss Marple said, the latch can be manipulated from outside. Or perhaps it was never properly latched in the first place. Tell me, who knew the study well enough to know about the window latch? Chapter 9. A Letter in the Hearth. They returned to the drawing room in uneasy silence. Miss Marple noticed that each person positioned themselves with careful attention to the others, ensuring no one stood behind them and no one was too close. The trust that held polite society together had shattered entirely. I shall make tea, Mrs. Harcourt announced, rising with forced brightness. We must maintain some semblance of normality. I'll come with you, Dr. March said quickly. No one should be alone. They departed together, leaving Miss Marple with the colonel and Mrs. Selby. The colonel resumed his pacing, while Mrs. Selby stared into the fire that had been lit against the morning chill. Miss Marple rose and moved to the hearth, ostensibly to warm her hands, but her sharp eyes were examining the grate, the ash, the small debris that accumulated in any fireplace. Something white caught her attention, wedged between the fire brick and the iron. A scrap of paper, partially burned, its edges blackened, but the center still legible. Colonel, she said quietly, might I trouble you for the poker? He handed it to her without question, and Miss Marple carefully extracted the paper fragment. It was heavy stock, expensive, the kind used for personal correspondence. She unfolded it gently, and words appeared, written in an elegant, feminine hand. My dear Mrs. Selby, your payment is now 3 months in arrears. I regret to inform you that unless the full amount is received by Christmas, I shall have no choice but to make certain facts known to the authorities. The matter of your late husband's death cannot remain concealed indefinitely. Your obedient servant, Leonard Avery. Mrs. Selby made a small sound, half gasp, half sob. So he was blackmailing you as well, the colonel said heavily. We were all his victims. Not all, Miss Marple corrected gently. Dr. March appears to have been innocent of any wrongdoing, and poor Elsie was merely unfortunate enough to know too much. She examined the letter more closely. This was burned recently. The ash is still quite fresh. I burned it. Mrs. Selby's voice was flat, defeated. Last night after I spoke with you, Miss Marple. I found it in the writing desk drawer. Avery must have kept copies of all his blackmail letters there. I couldn't bear for anyone to see it, to know what I had done. "You killed your husband," the colonel said. "It was not a question. Yes, in India during the war. He was a monster, Colonel. He beat me, humiliated me, threatened to destroy me financially if I ever tried to leave. One night during a party, I pushed him from the balcony. Everyone believed he was drunk and fell. Only Avery suspected the truth. How did he know?" Miss Marple asked. "He was there, at the party. He saw me on the balcony with my husband just before he fell. He couldn't prove anything, but he knew. And he's been bleeding me dry ever since." Mrs. Harcourt and Dr. March returned with the tea tray. The atmosphere in the room was thick with revelation and accusation. Mrs. Harcourt poured with trembling hands. "We've all suffered at Avery's hands," Dr. March said quietly. "He was a parasite, feeding on others' misfortunes." Miss Marple accepted her tea and took a small sip, gathering her thoughts. The pieces were nearly all in place now, but something still eluded her. Some crucial detail that would illuminate the whole. "Tell me," she said, setting down her cup. "This house party you mentioned, the one in '98, what exactly happened there?" The colonel and Dr. March exchanged glances. Finally, the colonel spoke. "There was a card game, rather high stakes. My brother Edward was young and foolish, and he lost badly, more than he could pay. The debt would have ruined him, destroyed any chance of a respectable future." "So you paid his debts," Miss Marple prompted. "I borrowed against the regimental funds. I intended to replace the money before anyone noticed, but investments went poorly. I couldn't repay it without revealing what I'd done. Edward never knew I had taken that risk for him. I never told him, but Avery knew. Avery was there. He always had a nose for scandal, for weakness. He approached me months later with his demands." Miss Marple nodded slowly. The pattern was clear now. Avery had collected secrets like a miser collects gold. Mrs. Selby's murder of her husband, the colonel's embezzlement. Each revelation had been a weapon in his hands. And yet, she said thoughtfully, someone decided that enough was enough. Someone poisoned Mr. Avery's brandy, murdered poor Elsie when she threatened to tell what she knew, and arranged for Edward's death when he tried to destroy evidence? But who? Mrs. Harcourt's voice rose. "You keep speaking in riddles, Miss Marple. If you know who the killer is, for heaven's sake, tell us." Miss Marple rose and moved to the window. Outside she could see movement on the road, a figure on horseback making slow progress through the snow. "Help is coming," she observed. "The police will be here within the hour, I should think. Before they arrive, I believe we should examine one more piece of evidence." She withdrew the leather glove from her pocket, the one she had found by the window the previous night. "This glove belongs to the killer." It was dropped when they stood outside the drawing-room window, listening to Mrs. Selby's confession. They needed to know what she had told me, what I had learned. She held the glove up to the light. "It's a gentleman's glove, expensive but not new. And there, on the inside, embroidered in silk thread, are the initials E.H., Edward's initials." "Edward's glove," the colonel breathed. "But Edward is dead." "Yes, which means someone else was wearing Edward's glove. Someone who had access to his belongings. Someone who could move through this house unseen and unquestioned." Miss Marple turned to face them all, her expression sorrowful but resolute. "There is one person in this house who had motive to kill all three victims, who had the knowledge to poison Avery, the strength to push Elsie down the stairs, and the callousness to murder Edward while he slept. One person who's been manipulating events from the beginning, who saw in Avery's blackmail scheme an opportunity to rid themselves of multiple problems at once." She paused, letting her words settle like snow. "One person who stood to gain everything if the blackmail ended and the secrets were buried forever. One person who has been frightened and desperate and willing to do anything to protect themselves." The room held its breath. "Mrs. Harcourt," Miss Marple said gently, I believe you killed them all. Chapter 10. Truth Before Morning. The silence that followed was absolute. Mrs. Harcourt stood frozen, the teapot still in her hand, her face draining of all color. Then she laughed, a brittle sound like breaking glass. That's absurd. I'm the mistress of this house. Why would I kill anyone? Because you knew, Mrs. Harcourt, Miss Marple said quietly. You knew about your husband's embezzlement, despite what he believed. You knew about the blackmail, about the money bleeding away month after month. You knew this house, your position, everything you valued, was slipping through your fingers. That's not true. I knew nothing about any embezzlement. I think you did. A wife always knows when her husband is in distress. You're an intelligent woman, Mrs. Harcourt. You managed this household. You saw the accounts. You watched as staff were dismissed, as economies were made. You asked questions, and eventually you learned the truth. The Colonel was staring at his wife with dawning horror. Margaret, Miss Marple continued, her voice gentle but implacable. When Mr. Avery arrived last night, you claimed no such visit had been arranged, but I think you knew he was coming. I think you invited him, in fact, under false pretenses. You told him there was urgent business to discuss, something that required his presence on Christmas Eve. Why would I do that? Because you needed him here, in this house, where you could control the situation. You'd been planning this for some time, I suspect, long enough to obtain cyanide to prepare your trap. Dr. March stepped forward. Miss Marple, are you certain? The cyanide came from somewhere, but not from my supplies. No, not from yours. But cyanide is not so difficult to obtain if one knows where to look. Rat poison contains it, for instance. Photography chemicals, and you, Mrs. Harcourt, grew up in a household where your father was a chemist, did you not? I recall you mentioned it at dinner, quite casually, when discussing Christmas traditions. Mrs. Harcourt's hand tightened on the teapot. My father has been dead for 20 years, but his knowledge passed to you. His books, his equipment, perhaps stored in this very house. You had access to the means, and you certainly had motive. With Avery dead, the blackmail would end. Your husband would be safe, your position secure. You're building castles of air, Miss Marple. None of this is proof. No, not yet. But let me continue. Miss Marple settled back into her chair, her hands folded in her lap. You poisoned the brandy glass, not the decanter. You prepared it earlier in the evening and left it on the sideboard, knowing Avery would pour himself a drink. Men of his type always do. You see, they take what they please without asking, Elsie. Said she saw him pour the drink himself. Yes, but Elsie saw him pour brandy into a glass that was already sitting on the tray. A glass you had prepared and positioned there. When he drank it, the poison took effect quickly. Cyanide works within minutes, Mrs. Selby leaned forward. But the door was locked from the inside. How could Mrs. Harcourt have done that? She didn't need to. Avery locked it himself, as we believed. He poured his drink, locked the door for privacy while he examined his papers, and then sat down to gloat over his conquests. The poison killed him there, alone, exactly as Mrs. Harcourt planned. Then how did I alter the document? Mrs. Harcourt's voice was sharp. You had a key, the key from the kitchen that Mrs. Selby later took. You entered after Avery was dead, examined the document to ensure it contained what you expected, and then you made your mistake. Miss Marple's eyes were sad but unyielding. You should have left well enough alone, but you were worried about Dr. March. He had been a close friend of the family for years. He knew things, suspected things. You wanted insurance against the possibility that he might piece together the truth. So you altered the document to implicate him, using skills you learned from helping your father with his correspondence all those years ago. You cannot prove any of this. The candles prove it. You moved the candelabra to see better while you worked. You used candle wax to reseal the envelope. but it was wax from a different candle, one you brought with you. You were careful, but not careful enough. The colonel sank into a chair, his face in his hands. Margaret, tell me this isn't true. Mrs. Harcourt said nothing, her jaw clenched tight. Poor Elsie was your second victim, Miss Marple continued. She had seen something that troubled her. Perhaps she noticed the prepared glass before Avery arrived. Perhaps she saw you coming from the study after you altered the document. Whatever it was, she confronted you, didn't she? Late in the evening, after everyone had retired. She knew nothing. She knew enough to make you desperate. You met her in the hallway near the servants' stairs. You argued, and when she threatened to tell what she had seen, you pushed her. The bruises on her arms match your grip, I imagine. A woman's grip, strong from years of household management. Mrs. Selby was pale, and Edward was the tragedy you hadn't anticipated. Miss Marple's voice was heavy with sorrow. He discovered something, perhaps the altered document, perhaps something else. He knew his brother was in danger of false accusations. Being a loyal brother, he tried to burn the evidence. But you couldn't allow that, could you? The document was your insurance, your protection. So you gave him a sleeping draft. Knowing his habit of sitting by the gas fire in the evening, knowing the fire would eventually go out and the gas would continue to flow. You're inventing stories. Miss Marple, fairy tales for your own amusement. Am I? Miss Marple reached into her knitting bag and withdrew a small glass vial. I found this in your room this morning while you were preparing tea. It contained a sleeping draught, the same type found in Edward's glass. The bottle is from Dr. March's dispensary. The label is still partially visible. Dr. March took the bottle from her, his face grim. This was stolen from my bag 3 days ago. I assumed I had misplaced it. You wore Edward's gloves when you stood outside the drawing room window, Miss Marple said. You needed to know what Mrs. Selby had told me, what I had learned. But in your haste, you dropped one. That was your final mistake. Mrs. Harcourt's composure cracked at last. The teapot fell from her hands and shattered on the floor. Tea spread across the carpet like blood. You don't understand, her voice roared. I had no choice. Avery was destroying us, month after month, year after year, taking... Her voice broke. Outside, the distant sound of hooves on snow grew louder. The police had arrived.